The morning of February 14th, 2025, dawned cold and crisp over Washington, D.C., but nothing could have prepared the world for the inferno that was about to erupt inside the White House. The Canadian delegation's motorcade rolled through the iron gates at precisely 9:47 a.m., their black SUVs gleaming in the winter sun like harbingers of an unavoidable confrontation. Inside those vehicles sat Prime Minister Mark Carney, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, and a team of Canada's most seasoned diplomats. Men and women who had negotiated everything from trade deals to Arctic sovereignty. Yet none of them, not even the battle-hardened Carney, could shake the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in their stomachs. President Donald Trump had been unpredictable before, but recent weeks had shown a side of him that terrified even his closest allies. His threats against Canada weren't mere political posturing anymore. They were detailed, specific, and delivered with the kind of cold precision that suggested they had already been war-gamed in the Situation Room. Canada has taken advantage of us for decades, he had tweeted just hours before the meeting. Tomorrow, we make America's position crystal clear. No more Mr. Nice Guy. The tweet had sent shockwaves through Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver. Stock markets trembled. The Canadian dollar dropped 2 cents in overnight trading. As the Canadians were escorted through the West Wing's labyrinthine corridors, they could feel eyes upon them, staffers whispering, Secret Service agents standing straighter than usual, the very air thick with anticipation. An aide informed them that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick would be joining the president. Translation: this wasn't a friendly chat. This was an ambush dressed up as diplomacy. Prime Minister Carney exchanged a glance with Minister Joly. Her eyes said what her lips couldn't. We're walking into a trap, and we both know it. The Roosevelt Room had been prepared with meticulous care. American flags stood at attention behind Trump's chair. The presidential seal gleamed on the table. But it was the seating arrangement that told the real story. Trump at the head, flanked by his officials like generals preparing for battle. The Canadians were positioned opposite, isolated, outnumbered. Every detail had been choreographed to send a message. You are not equals here. You are supplicants. At exactly 10 a.m., the door swung open. President Trump strode in, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. He didn't offer handshakes. He didn't smile. He simply sat down, leaned back in his chair, and fixed Carney with a stare that could freeze molten steel. Let's get down to business, Trump said, his voice low and menacing. Because frankly, I'm tired of being played for a fool. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This wasn't going to be a negotiation. This was going to be an execution. Carney, to his credit, didn't flinch. Mr. President, Canada has always been America's most reliable ally. We fought alongside you in every major conflict since. Trump cut him off with a dismissive wave. Spare me the history lesson, Mark. I know you're a smart guy. Former Bank of England governor. Very impressive. But you're not here to give me a TED Talk. You're here because your country has been ripping us off for 75 years, and it ends today. The room fell silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. Secretary Rubio shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was worse than anyone had anticipated. Trump pulled out a folder, thick, ominous, clearly well-researched, and slapped it on the table. Energy, lumber, dairy, pharmaceuticals. Do you know how much money flows out of America into Canada every single day? Billions. And what do we get in return? Supply management systems that block our farmers, trade barriers that hurt our workers, a border that's a joke for illegal immigrants and terrorists. Joly tried to interject, her voice steady despite the tension. Mr. President, with all due respect, those figures don't account for the integrated nature of our economies. American auto parts crossed the border 8 times before. I don't care about auto parts. Trump thundered, slamming his palm on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I care about American jobs. I care about American security. And right now, Canada is a threat to both. The word threat hung in the air like a mushroom cloud. Had an American president just called Canada peaceful, friendly, harmless Canada a threat? Carney felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was spiraling out of control faster than anyone could have imagined. He had prepared for tough negotiations, maybe even some heated rhetoric. But this was something else entirely. This was a president who had already made up his mind, who saw allies as enemies, who viewed diplomacy as weakness. And then Trump delivered the knockout punch. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Carney's, and spoke with terrifying calm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Ottawa, and you're going to tell your government that unless Canada makes major concessions on trade, defense spending, and border security within the next 30 days, the United States will impose tariffs that will devastate your economy. We'll cut off energy exports. We'll restrict Canadian access to American markets. We'll make your country feel pain like it's never felt before. He paused, letting the threats sink in. And if you think I'm bluffing, Mark, you don't know me very well. The meeting hadn't even reached the halfway point, and already the foundation of North American relations was cracking. Outside the Roosevelt Room, aides pressed their ears to the door, trying to catch fragments of the conversation. Reporters waited in the briefing room, sensing that something historic and possibly catastrophic was unfolding. And in capitals around the world, from London to Beijing to Moscow, intelligence analysts watched and waited, knowing that if the United States and Canada, the two nations that shared the world's longest undefended border, the two countries that had stood together through depression and war and terrorism, if they turned on each other, the entire global order would be thrown into chaos. The storm had arrived, and it was only just beginning. 10 minutes after Trump's ultimatum, the temperature in the Roosevelt Room hadn't just dropped. It had plummeted into Arctic territory. Prime Minister Carney sat motionless, his face a mask of diplomatic composure. But inside, his mind was racing through scenarios, calculations, and worst-case outcomes. 30 days. Trump had given Canada 30 days to either capitulate or face economic warfare. It was an impossible deadline, designed not to succeed but to fail, giving Trump the pretext he needed to unleash his most aggressive policies. But Carney hadn't survived decades in the brutal worlds of finance and politics by backing down from bullies. He took a measured breath, clasped his hands on the table, and looked Trump directly in the eyes. Mr. President, he began, his voice steady as steel, threatening your closest ally is not strength. It's recklessness. Canada and the United States share more than a border. We share values, history, sacrifice. Canadian soldiers died on Juno Beach. We stood with you after September 11th. We've integrated our economies so deeply that hurting us means hurting yourself. Trump's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being lectured, especially not by someone he viewed as subordinate. Don't talk to me about 9/11, he shot back. You want to know who really stood with us? The countries that pay their fair share for defense. Canada spends, 1% of GDP on military? Meanwhile, American taxpayers foot the bill for NORAD, for NATO, for protecting your airspace and your coastlines. You've been freeloading for decades. Secretary Lutnick jumped in, his voice sharp. And let's talk about trade. The U.S. trade deficit with Canada hit $30 billion last year. $30 billion. Your dairy cartel blocks our farmers with tariffs exceeding 200%. Your lumber industry gets subsidies that our companies can't compete with. This isn't partnership, Prime Minister. It's parasitism. Minister Jolie couldn't stay silent any longer. That's a gross mischaracterization of the data, she interjected, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain calm. If you look at trade and services, intellectual property, and integrated supply chains, the relationship is balanced. American companies make billions from Canadian resources. Your car manufacturers depend on our auto parts. Your consumers rely on our energy during winter. Your energy that we overpay for. Trump interrupted. Oil, natural gas, electricity. Canada needs us more than we need you. We've got the Permian Basin, the Bakken Formation. We're energy independent now. So here's the reality check. If we cut off imports from Canada, you'd be devastated. If you cut off exports to us, we'd barely notice. The bluntness of Trump's words landed like a physical blow. It wasn't just the threat. It was the casual cruelty, the dismissiveness, the complete absence of diplomatic niceties. Carney could see his team struggling to maintain composure. One of his advisors, a veteran diplomat named Sarah Chun, looked like she wanted to flip the table. Another, trade expert Michael Rousseau, was scribbling furious notes, probably calculating the economic fallout of Trump's proposed tariffs. But it was what Trump said next that truly stunned the room. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, and spoke with chilling nonchalance. You know, Mark, I've been thinking. Maybe Canada's just too big to manage. Alberta's tired of subsidizing Quebec. The West wants in on American prosperity. I've been getting calls, provincial leaders, business people, regular Canadians who are sick of Ottawa's incompetence. They're asking, why not become American states? Think about it. No more currency fluctuations, access to the full American market, real representation in Washington. The suggestion, barely veiled, utterly audacious, hung in the air like a war declaration. Trump was openly discussing the dissolution of Canada as a sovereign nation. Not as a joke, not as a hypothetical, but as a genuine policy option he was considering. Carney's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about tariffs or trade deficits. This was about something far more sinister. An American president who saw Canada not as an ally, but as territory ripe for absorption. That is absolutely outrageous. Carney exploded, his diplomatic facade finally cracking. You're talking about the end of a sovereign nation. Canada is not some failed state you can carve up and distribute. We are a G7 economy, a democracy with 39 million people who would fight to their last breath to preserve our independence. Trump didn't even blink. Then maybe you should start acting like a sovereign nation instead of a welfare state mooching off American generosity. You want to be treated as an equal? Earn it. Increase your defense, spending to 2% immediately. Eliminate supply management. Open your markets completely and secure your border, because right now it's a highway for drugs, criminals, and God knows what else. Secretary Rubio, clearly uncomfortable with how far Trump had gone, attempted to soften the blow. Mr. Prime Minister, what the president is trying to say is that we need to see concrete action. The American people are tired of one-sided relationships. If Canada demonstrates that it values this alliance, we can work through these issues. But it requires effort from both sides. But the damage was done. Trump had already revealed his hand, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. He didn't just want concessions. He wanted submission. He wanted Canada to kneel, to beg, to accept subordinate status in a relationship that had always been built on mutual respect and equality. And if Canada refused, the implications were terrifying. Economic sanctions that would trigger a recession. Border closures that would strangle trade. A propaganda campaign to convince Canadians that joining the United States was their only salvation. Carney looked around the room at the grim faces of the American officials. Some, like Rubio, seemed genuinely troubled by Trump's extremism. Others, like Lutnick, appeared to relish the confrontation. But all of them, regardless of their personal feelings, would follow Trump's orders. The President of the United States had spoken, and the machinery of American power would move inexorably forward, crushing anything or anyone in its path. "This meeting is over," Carney announced, standing abruptly. His delegation followed suit, gathering their materials in tense silence. "Mr. President, you've made your position clear. I need to consult with my cabinet and with the Canadian people. But understand this, Canada will not be bullied. We will not surrender our sovereignty, and we will not forget this day." Trump rose as well, extending his hand for a handshake that Carney reluctantly accepted. The president's grip was firm, almost crushing. 30 days, Mark, Trump reminded him quietly. The clock's ticking. As the Canadians filed out of the Roosevelt Room, every step felt heavier than the last. They had entered the White House as representatives of a sovereign nation. They left as hostages to an ultimatum that could shatter the longest peaceful border on Earth. Within 90 minutes of the Canadian delegation's departure from the White House, the world had caught fire. Not literally, of course, but diplomatically and economically, the shockwaves were devastating. Prime Minister Carney, still reeling from Trump's threats, had barely reached the Canadian embassy when his phone began exploding with calls from world leaders. Emmanuel Macron from France, Keir Starmer from the UK, Olaf Scholz from Germany, Narendra Modi from India. Even Xi Jinping's foreign ministry requested an urgent conversation. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Had the President of the United States really just threatened to dismantle Canada? The answer, horrifyingly, was yes. And the implications stretched far beyond North America. If Trump could bully Canada, stable, democratic, Western-aligned Canada, then no ally was safe. NATO allies in Europe began emergency consultations, wondering if they'd be next on Trump's hit list. Asian democracies like Japan and South Korea quietly reached out to Canadian diplomats, seeking intelligence on Trump's state of mind. Even Russia and China, traditional adversaries of both nations, watched with barely concealed glee as the Western alliance tore itself apart from within. Back in Ottawa, Carney convened an emergency cabinet meeting at 3 p.m. The mood in the Langevin bloc was grim. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland presented economic projections that made everyone's stomach turn. If Trump followed through on his tariff threats, Canada would face an immediate GDP contraction of 4 to 6%. Unemployment would spike. The dollar would crater. Industries dependent on cross-border supply chains, automotive, aerospace, agriculture, would be decimated overnight. This isn't just a recession, Freeland warned, her voice heavy with dread. This could be the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Defense Minister Bill Blair added a military dimension that chilled the room. If trade war escalates to actual conflict, and I'm not saying it will, but we need to consider worst-case scenarios. Canada is catastrophically unprepared. Our armed forces number 67,000 active personnel. The United States has over 1 million. We share an 8,000-kilometer border that we cannot possibly defend. NORAD integration means American forces control much of our airspace. If Trump decided to, he couldn't even finish the sentence. The thought was too horrifying, but it was what happened in the American media that truly demonstrated how far things had spiraled. Fox News, unsurprisingly, backed Trump completely. Sean Hannity declared, "Finally, a president who won't let Canada push us around." Tucker Carlson devoted an entire segment to explaining why Canadian provinces would be better off as American states. Even some mainstream outlets, terrified of Trump's wrath, soft-pedaled their criticism, focusing on legitimate trade concerns rather than the existential threat to Canadian sovereignty. Social media became a battleground. Hashtag #StandWithCanada trended worldwide, with millions expressing solidarity. But hashtag America First trolls flooded the zone with propaganda. Maps showing a United States of North America, memes mocking Canadian military weakness, conspiracy theories about Ottawa's supposed anti-American agenda. The information warfare was so sophisticated, so coordinated, that Canadian intelligence agencies suspected Russian amplification. Moscow loved nothing more than watching the West devour itself. Meanwhile, in provincial capitals across Canada, reactions varied wildly. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, long frustrated with federal climate policies, made a stunning statement. "Maybe it's time we explored all options, including closer integration with American energy markets." It was a barely veiled flirtation with Trump's annexation suggestion, and it sent shockwaves through Canadian politics. Quebec, predictably, rallied around sovereignty, but this time it meant Canadian sovereignty against American aggression. British Columbia's premier called for calm, but privately told Carney that if Trump imposed tariffs, the province would face economic catastrophe within weeks. At the United Nations, Canada's ambassador requested an emergency Security Council meeting, invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter. The motion was immediately vetoed by the United States, of course, but the symbolism was powerful. Canada was telling the world, "We are under threat from our closest ally, and we need help." Small and medium powers took notice. If America would betray Canada, who else was expendable? New Zealand's Prime Minister publicly expressed deep concern. Mexico, already battered by Trump's immigration policies, reached out to Carney to discuss a unified Latin American-Canadian response. But perhaps the most ominous development came from the financial markets. Currency traders, hedge funds, and institutional investors began betting against Canada. The loonie dropped 5 cents against the dollar in a single day, a catastrophic collapse. Canadian government bonds were downgraded. Foreign investment froze. Corporations with cross-border operations started contingency planning to relocate headquarters to the United States. The economic hemorrhaging had begun, and Trump hadn't even imposed a single tariff yet. The mere threat was enough to trigger panic. Inside the White House, Trump watched the chaos with satisfaction. According to leaked reports from staffers, he was genuinely enjoying the spectacle. "They're finally taking me seriously," he reportedly told advisors. Canada thought they could coast on good vibes, and maple syrup. Well, welcome to the real world. But not everyone in his administration shared his enthusiasm. Secretary of State Rubio privately warned that alienating Canada could drive them into closer relationships with China and Europe. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth noted that Canadian military cooperation was essential for Arctic defense. Even some Republican senators began expressing quiet reservations. But Trump didn't care about dissent within his ranks. He had a 30-day timeline, and he intended to use every second to maximize pressure on Canada. The next morning, he authorized the deployment of additional Border Patrol agents to the northern border, ostensibly to address security concerns. In reality, it was a show of force, a reminder that America had military assets positioned all along Canada's southern flank. He also instructed the Commerce Department to begin drafting tariff schedules, targeting dairy, lumber, aluminum, and steel, the pillars of Canada's export economy. Canadian citizens, watching their country under siege, reacted with a mixture of defiance and despair. In Toronto, tens of thousands gathered at Nathan Phillips Square in a spontaneous rally supporting Canadian sovereignty. In Montreal, protesters burned American flags outside the U.S. consulate. In Vancouver, dock workers threatened to strike if forced to handle American goods under coercive conditions. The Canadian spirit, long dormant under decades of peaceful prosperity, was awakening, angry, defensive, and utterly unprepared for the fight ahead. Back in the Langevin block, Prime Minister Carney stared at the reports flooding his desk. Economic projections, military assessments, public opinion polls, international reactions. Every document told the same story. Canada was in the fight of its life, and it was a fight they might not win. He thought about the generations of Canadians who had built this country, who had fought for its independence, who had believed in a future where Canada stood as a beacon of peace and prosperity. And now, all of that was at risk because of one man's ego and ambition. The countdown had begun. 29 days remained, and no one, not in Ottawa, not in Washington, not in any capital on earth, knew how this would end. Day 15. Exactly halfway through Trump's ultimatum, and the situation had gone from crisis to catastrophe. Prime Minister Carney sat alone in his office at 24 Sussex Drive, the official residence that suddenly felt more like a bunker than a home. Outside, a harsh February wind rattled the windows. Inside, the weight of an impossible choice pressed down on his shoulders. Surrender Canada's sovereignty piece by piece, or face economic and possibly military devastation. The past 2 weeks had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. Trump hadn't imposed tariffs yet, but he'd done something arguably worse. He'd created an atmosphere of relentless uncertainty. One day, he'd tweet about productive conversations with Canadian business leaders exploring statehood. The next, he'd threaten immediate sanctions unless Ottawa met unspecified demands. The whipsaw effect was deliberate, designed to break Canadian morale, to make capitulation seem like relief rather than defeat. And it was working. Finance Minister Freeland had just delivered the worst news yet. Major corporations were beginning to relocate. Bombardier announced operational adjustments that would shift production to Alabama. Magna International, one of Canada's automotive giants, was exploring options in Tennessee. Even Canadian tech startups, the pride of Toronto and Vancouver, were quietly registering Delaware corporations. The brain drain was accelerating. The economic foundation of the country was crumbling in real time. But Carney refused to break, against the advice of many in his cabinet. He had spent the last 2 weeks building an international coalition. He'd flown to Brussels for emergency talks with EU leadership. He'd secured commitments from Britain to fast-track a comprehensive trade agreement. He'd even held a historic call with President Xi Jinping, discussing expanded energy exports to China. It was a desperate gambit. Pivoting away from American dependence would take years and cost billions. But it was the only path that preserved Canadian sovereignty. Trump, of course, was furious. When news leaked of Canada's diplomatic offensive, he took to Truth Social with characteristic venom. Trudeau 2.0 thinks he can play footsie with China. Wrong. Every deal Canada makes with our enemies is another nail in their coffin. They have 15 days to come to their senses. After that, the pain begins. The tweet was vintage Trump, misspelling Carney's name, conflating him with Trudeau, and issuing threats that sounded more like mob boss intimidation than presidential communication. What frightened Carney most wasn't Trump's bluster. It was the silence from reasonable voices in America. Where was the business community that depended on Canadian resources? Where were the border state governors whose economies relied on cross-border trade? Where was Congress, constitutionally empowered to regulate commerce? A few Democrats had issued tepid statements of concern, but Republicans remained lockstep behind Trump. The message was clear. When it came to Canada, American political will had unified behind aggression. Then came the incident that nearly pushed both nations past the point of no return. On day 17, U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents detained a convoy of Canadian truckers at the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit, citing security concerns. The trucks were held for 12 hours in freezing temperatures. Perishable goods spoiled. Just-in-time supply chains seized up. When the drivers were finally released, without explanation or apology, Canadian public opinion exploded. Protesters descended on the American embassy in Ottawa by the thousands. Someone threw a brick through a window. Riot police were deployed. In Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, solidarity demonstrations turned into anti-American rallies. Canadian flags flew at half-mast. An impromptu boycott of American goods spread through social media. The rage was genuine, visceral, and terrifyingly powerful. Carney realized with a chill that if he gave the order, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Canadians would mobilize for confrontation. But that was exactly what Trump wanted. Carney could see the trap clearly now, provoke Canada into overreaction, then use that as justification for crushing retaliation. If Canadian citizens attacked American interests, Trump would have the domestic support he needed for sanctions, border closures, maybe even military action. It would be framed as self-defense, as protecting American citizens from Canadian aggression. The narrative was pre-written. All it needed was one violent incident. So Carney did something that required more courage than any military action ever could. He went on national television and asked Canadians for restraint. "I know you're angry," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "I'm angry too. What's happening to our country is unjust, unprecedented, and unacceptable. But we will not give Trump the excuse he's looking for. We will not become the aggressors. We will fight this battle with diplomacy, with economic resilience, and with the moral authority that comes from being in the right." The speech worked barely. Protests continued, but remained peaceful. The boycott of American goods intensified, but stayed nonviolent. Carney had bought time, but he knew it couldn't last. Every day, the pressure built. Every day, the deadline drew closer. And every day, Trump's demands became more extreme. Now he wanted Canada to not only eliminate supply management and increase defense spending, but also to withdraw from certain UN positions, to align voting patterns with U.S. interests, to essentially become a vassal state in all but name. On day 28, just 2 days before the deadline, Carney received an unexpected phone call. It was Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's closest allies. "Prime Minister," Graham said, his southern drawl carrying a note of genuine concern, "I'm calling off the record. The president is serious about this. Dead serious. If you don't give him something, anything, he's going to pull the trigger. And when he does, there's no walking it back. You need to understand, he sees this as a legacy moment. Breaking Canada is, in his mind, proof that America first works." Carney thanked Graham for the warning, but he'd already made his decision. That evening, he drafted a final response to Trump's ultimatum. It was delivered through diplomatic channels at midnight, 36 hours before the deadline. The message was brief but devastating. Canada will not comply with demands that compromise our sovereignty. We remain open to good faith negotiations between equals, but we will not be coerced, bullied, or threatened into submission. Do what you must. We will endure. The response hit Washington like a thunderclap. Trump, according to White House sources, went ballistic. He reportedly screamed at his staff, "They think they can call my bluff? They're about to learn the biggest lesson of their pathetic little country's existence." He ordered the Commerce Department to finalize tariff schedules immediately. He directed the Pentagon to prepare military readiness exercises along the Canadian border. He instructed his communications team to launch a full-spectrum media assault portraying Canada as hostile, ungrateful, and dangerously aligned with American enemies. But then something extraordinary happened. On the morning of day 30, the final day of the ultimatum, President Trump woke up to a political reality he hadn't anticipated. Overnight, a coalition of Republican business leaders, including executives from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and major automotive companies, had released a joint statement warning that tariffs on Canada would trigger immediate recession in America. They cited specific numbers: 3 million American jobs dependent on Canadian trade, $718 billion in annual bilateral commerce, critical supply chains that couldn't be replicated. Simultaneously, a group of Republican governors from border states, Michigan, New York, Montana, North Dakota, issued their own statement, far more diplomatic but equally clear. Damaging relations with Canada would devastate their economies. Even Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader known for his cautious approach, released a carefully worded comment urging thoughtful consideration of America's longest and most successful alliance. Trump was cornered. He'd built up this confrontation, made it a test of his will, and now his own political coalition was fracturing. If he backed down completely, he'd look weak. If he followed through, he'd trigger economic chaos that could cost him the 2028 election. He needed an exit ramp, something that would let him declare victory while avoiding catastrophe. At 4:47 p.m. on February 28th, just hours before the deadline, Trump tweeted, "After productive discussions, Canada has agreed to meaningful reforms on trade and defense. Great deal for America. Details forthcoming." It was vintage Trump, vague, self-congratulatory, and completely divorced from reality. Canada had agreed to nothing, but the tweet provided the face-saving fiction both sides desperately needed. Over the next 72 hours, back-channel negotiations produced a joint statement so carefully worded that both sides could claim victory. Canada committed to reviewing defense spending but made no specific promises. The U.S. agreed to consultations on trade issues but imposed no actual tariffs. Both nations affirmed their unbreakable alliance, while everyone knew the relationship had been irrevocably damaged. The crisis, at least the acute phase, was over. But nothing would ever be the same. Canada had learned a terrifying lesson. American friendship was conditional, transactional, and could evaporate overnight. The trust that had defined the relationship for generations was shattered. In the months and years to come, Canada would diversify its trade relationships, increase its military capabilities, and build diplomatic bridges beyond North America. The era of reflexive Canadian-American alignment was finished, and Trump, he moved on to his next confrontation, barely remembering the crisis he'd manufactured. But historians would remember. They would study this moment as a turning point. The month when America's closest ally realized it could no longer depend on American goodwill. The meeting in the Roosevelt Room hadn't broken the alliance completely, but it had cracked the foundation so severely that every future interaction would be shadowed by the memory of February 2025, when the world's longest peaceful border almost became a front line. Some wounds never fully heal, and some mistakes can never be undone.